Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us in person and online for this very important discussion about Central America. I want to thank our speakers for being here. I know you guys are incredibly busy, so thank you for taking time out of your days to be here. I want to start actually, I just want to mention that we have Molly McCoy here, and this is something I was just chatting with you. We typically don't include this Department of Labor, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. So Molly is the Associate Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs at the Department of Labor. We also have Milady Galarte, she's the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID, doing tremendous work in the region. And Eric Jacobstein, a close friend of the dialogue, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department. And you moved over there how long ago? About a month and a half ago. But you had been deeply embedded in these issues for a long time before that. So I think everyone here is tracking that Central America is experiencing one of its most complex and difficult periods since the civil conflicts of the 80s. This includes, but is not limited to, the alarming and deliberate dismantling of democratic institutions and essential freedom, continued irregular migration, and slow economic growth with limited opportunities for citizens. So in this context, we're going to have the opportunity to hear updates on the Biden-Harris administration's strategy to address the root causes of migration and also the Central America Forward program. We're also going to have a chance to hear about what's happening in particular countries, including Guatemala's presidential election, which I know we're all watching very closely, further descent into authoritarianism in Nicaragua, and the grave human rights violations in El Salvador. So I want to get straight to the substantive discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Manuel Orozco, who's the director of the Inter-American Dialogue's Migration, Remittances, and Development Program.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you to our panelists for joining us to this conversation. I think everyone is excited. I don't know who's more excited, them for the questions you came prepared to ask, or you for the questions you are bringing to them. But there is definitely a lot of interest on the region. I must say, Rebecca was just mentioning some of the issues in the region. I mean, one of the realities is that we are dealing right now with at least 3 police states in Central America. El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua are really pushing the envelope all the way towards very limited freedom of expressions and other civil and political liberties. We also have serious problems with migration. So I think we have a lot of challenges, particularly to the extent to which it's difficult to tell right now which country is doing better or which country is actually performing the worst. But as we'll ask later, some of the questions I have is that I think there are silver linings. So in any case, I think what I would like you to start with is just to give a sense, to hear a sense from you three about, what is the work done so far by the administration, and then, move from there to some follow-up questions on that part. And thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Manuel, and thanks to Rebecca and the Inter-American Dialogue. It's as an Inter-American Dialogue alumnus, it's always a homecoming to be back here. So a pleasure to be here, and always a delight to be with Milady and Molly as well. So just quickly to start out, I would say the Biden-Harris administration's root causes strategy. The idea here is to provide hope and opportunity to the people of Central America, with the firm belief that a secure and prosperous future lies in individuals' home communities. And in our view, the root causes strategy not only benefits these communities, but also serves as a tool to enhance regional stability and to advance the mutual economic prosperity and national security of both Central America and the United States. So under Vice President Harris's leadership, the Biden-Harris administration has launched this $4 billion 4-year strategy in 2021. And the idea is to generate sustainable living conditions for all people throughout the region. And as many of you know quite well, the root cause strategy focuses on several areas, on creating jobs, on promoting democratic governance, protecting human rights, and improving security to ultimately help Central Americans build futures at home and ensure that individuals don't have to make the dangerous journey north. Um, from the start, I would say the administration's approach has differed from that of previous strategies in that there's a recognition of the importance of two drivers of migration that weren't necessarily front and center in previous strategies. One of those is gender-based violence, and the other is human rights. These are two standalone pillars of the root causes strategy. Let me say at the top, as Manuel and Rebecca have made clear, the issues we're confronting in Central America are obviously long-term challenges. And we're clear-eyed that change will not happen overnight. Our efforts here require sustained attention, they require collaboration. And they certainly require commitment to good governance from our partners in the region. Ultimately, without strong governance, it's hard to make progress across the different areas of the root cause strategy, from economic prosperity to security, whatever it may be. So I'd say, we're not naive, we're not Pollyannish about the challenges in front of us. But at the same time, the US government is taking significant steps to implement the root cause strategy. And part of the reason we're all excited to be here today is we hope that events like this can shed light on these efforts, even as the challenges remain extremely, extremely deep. Through the strategy, obviously, we're addressing the acute factors that drive irregular migration from Northern and Central America. And those include natural disasters, water and food insecurity, all of which are exacerbated by climate change, as well as long-term chronic structural challenges, including, as we've discussed, extreme poverty, gender-based violence, citizen security, poor governance, and endemic corruption. Respect for rule of law, vibrant civil society, free and independent press are obviously crucial to achieving these shared goals. And unsurprisingly, we still have a lot of work to do in all of these areas. Central America, as this group is well aware, faces increasing attacks against democratic institutions, against transparency, against the rule of law. So we'll continue to support actors in the region who defend democratic governance. And you see that happening today. The most obvious way we're doing that right now is partnering as a government with the Organization of American States, with the European Union, with like-minded countries, to push back on efforts to undermine Guatemalan institutions, such as the country's electoral tribunal. And I know we'll get more into Guatemala, I'm sure, during the conversation. But zooming out for a second of Guatemala, and over the last year of the root causes strategy implementation, State Department USAID have supported more than 1,500 human rights defenders, and also trained more than 300 journalists in that period. And that support, quickly provides help to embattled human rights defenders and civil society organizations, and that's through emergency assistance, through supporting these individuals. You all know about the Voices Initiative, or I think some of you do, in which the US government is bringing together all of its resources, public and private diplomacy, foreign assistance, and enforcement authorities to protect, defend, and promote civic space throughout the Central America region. So not just Northern Central America, certainly Nicaragua as well. And that's focused on promoting digital democracy, countering digital authoritarianism, promoting freedom of expression, and strengthening independent media, but also countering criminalization and providing protection for those who are targeted. The tools obviously aren't limited to foreign assistance and diplomacy. And on July 19th, the US government released our latest public list consistent with Section 353 of the US Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, which designates individuals who've engaged in significant acts of corruption or undermined democratic institutions. And that's in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Congress recently added Nicaragua to that reporting requirement as well. This reporting, it's a public name and shame effort, but it also generally requires that individuals are ineligible for visas and admission to the US. And our feeling is that this has been a critical tool in holding individuals accountable. To date, we've published 169 entries to the Section 353 list over the past 3 years. And that includes 48 from Guatemala, 31 from El Salvador, 45 from Honduras, and 45 from Nicaragua. Just turning to the economic side briefly, as Rebecca pointed out, Vice President Harris leads Central America Forward, which is an innovative public-private partnership with the Partnership for Central America to create good jobs in the region. And under Central America Forward, companies have committed to invest over $4.2 billion in the region. And these investments are creating jobs. They've connected 4 million people to the internet. They've brought more than 1 million people into the formal financial economy. And they've trained almost 500,000 people in workforce skills, including digital language skills. But it's just not about investment alone. And our private sector engagement, we're aiming to use it to reinforce the importance of the rule of law and good governance. Through that, the State Department and the Partnerships for Central America recently launched the Good Governance, Good Jobs Joint Declaration. And the idea here being to hold individuals accountable, to hold companies accountable, with the ability to, force companies to exit the partnership if they're not living up to that pledge. I would just briefly on, I've talked mostly about the root cause strategy, but, migration management, the efforts of the administration of migration management very much complement the root causes strategy. A little over a year ago, the US and 20 countries endorsed the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration Protection on the margins of some of the Americas. That's been a really critical tool, in terms of, ensuring countries are aligned on best practices and strategies to create conditions for safe, orderly, and humane migration. And as we've continued to carry out robust enforcement efforts on the southwest border, the administration's taken historic steps to increase lawful pathways. And so you see that in June 2023 through the announcement of safe mobility offices in Costa Rica, in Colombia, and Guatemala, and the initial 6-month phase of these offices. And the idea is to facilitate access to protection to other lawful pathways to the U.S. And also, in addition to that, our commitment to continue to, consider thousands of additional individuals from the Western Hemisphere for resettlement through the U.S. refugee admission process. I would just conclude here by saying that, this is not limited to Central America. Last week, our Homeland Security Advisor, Liz Sherwood-Randall, met with Mexican leaders to announce a new program in Mexico with the Mexican government in southern Mexico to offer new refugee and labor options. And the U.S. is committing through that to accept refugee resettlement efforts for qualified Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelan nationals already in Mexico, which complements the existing CHNV program. So just say this by no means a victory lap or mission complete moment. These are all long-term challenges. But it's important to show that, we feel like we're moving the needle and offer transparency about the ongoing challenges. So really look forward to the conversation with you all and hearing from Lady Molly.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. I want to thank the Inter-American Dialogue, Rebecca, Manuel. Thank you for organizing today's event. I don't think we've had one in a while, so glad that you've invited us. And thank you, all of you attending here in person, but also I think we have a big crowd that's joining virtually. I think Eric just really gave an excellent overview of the root causes strategy, which really builds on a lot of the work that USAID has done for a long time, right? Like create jobs, address corruption, empower the most vulnerable, and much more. But also, as he alluded to, we're clear-eyed that the strategy in itself is not a panacea. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing the undermining of elections or attacks on anti-corruption activists and so much more. But despite the challenges we're facing, I think there's been a positive development in all of the 3 countries that the strategy targets. This administration's commitment to Northern Central America includes one of the most robust foreign assistance packages we've seen in 3 decades, which is enabling USAID to double down on approaches that work. Just from FY21 to FY22, our budget increased by almost 40%. So again, we haven't seen the levels of resources that we're seeing since, I would say, the beginning of the early 90s. We also see signs that our root causes strategy programming is affecting migration. We have data showing that individuals who participate in our programs in areas of high out-migration now intend to migrate at a rate nearly 80% lower than the general population. The administration's focus on migration goes beyond the root causes strategy. We're taking a holistic approach because these large movements of people have political, social, and economic impacts across the hemisphere. That's why the Collaborative Migration Management Strategy laid the ground for the LA Declaration on Migration and Protection, which Eric highlighted. Launched last year, the declaration has encouraged further collaboration with 20 Latin American countries in the hemisphere, and not only to address the root causes, but also to expand lawful pathways and integrating migrants into host countries. We remain committed to supporting safe, orderly, and humane migration throughout our region. For example, our work with the governments of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras has helped nearly double the number of seasonal workers and fill critical labor gaps here in the US. We expect that number to continue to grow. Strong partnerships are critical to making progress, and the partnerships we forged with the interagency have helped us address the full scope of the challenge, tackling corruption, promoting human rights and democratic principles. Gender-based violence is also a real challenge for the region. Latin America and the Caribbean are home to a staggering 14 of the 25 countries with the world's highest rate of femicide. In Honduras, which has the worst rate of femicide in the region, women cite gender-based violence as a reason for migrating at almost twice the rate of men. Last year alone, our programs provided services to more than 30,000 survivors. We're also reaching people in new ways. We've partnered with TVC, the largest media conglomerate in Honduras, to air a telenovela series, Vencer el Pasado, or Overcoming the Past, which reached 3.8 million people. Episodes featuring plots and gender-based violence and cyberbullying served as the start of a public awareness campaign and brought this issue to the forefront of the national conversation, giving clear and hopeful messages to women and young people. Corruption is also another area of focus for USAID. As President Biden has said, corruption is a cancer that eats away at citizens' faith in democracy, wastes the talent of entire generations, scares investments and jobs, and denies people their dignity. According to the 2021 America's Barometer report, an astounding 3 in 5 citizens from the region believe there is widespread corruption among politicians. In response, USAID anti-corruption programs trained more than 8,000 government officials and NGO representatives last year, empowering people with knowledge of the ethical norms of their roles and the capacity to act against corruption, so they can hold criminals accountable and build public trust in institutions. That trust is critical to upholding democratic values. So last year, USAID and the Department of State, as Eric mentioned, we launched Voices. The initiative invests in tools to amplify democratic values such as transparency and accountability. And it supports our work alongside those standing up for democracy and human rights, including independent media. As we look ahead to the coming year, we see strong headwinds across Northern Central America, with potential for elections interference, increasing signs of authoritarianism, and crackdowns on freedom of expression. We've seen this before. You can look no further than Nicaragua for a sense of what happens when leaders drive civil society persecution, closure of media outlets, and attacks on religious institutions and individuals. We don't want to see that repeated in Northern Central America, so we'll continue to work alongside our neighbors in the region while remaining vigilant and outspoken. Thank you, and I look forward to the exchange we've had.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the dialogue for the invitation. Manuel, Rebecca, it's really a pleasure to be here. And if I had a caption under myself, I probably would say that, like, Department of Labor, really happy to be here. But we are, and I think Rebecca's opening point that there's not been a lot of engagement with the Department of Labor here at the dialogue, and I would say, in general, sort of known foreign policy spaces. But I think the reason that we're here and the reason we're here talking about the root causes strategy is because it does represent an evolution of the understanding of where decent work and labor rights fits within the migration question. And so if we look from where we sit as Department of Labor at the region and what we see as our vision or our mission, it is economies that are rooted in decent work. And by decent work, I mean jobs that offer safety and health, that offer a voice and rights at work, and that offer family sustaining livelihoods. Um, and that may seem very basic, but I've been in the government for about 2 years. I come from the labor movement. 10 years ago, we would not have had that conversation about why labor rights, why independent trade unions, why decent work is fundamental to democracy, not just in Northern Central America, but obviously globally. And we have seen really good examples of that in the region. There are tremendous challenges, and I know we will get questions on a lot of them, but I'd like to speak to a few things we've done under the root causes strategy, and also, because it is sort of our first time in this space, take a little bit of time to justify why this fits in. So, and in trade unions, labor rights, decent work is what we see as enabling people to stay and invest in their communities. Obviously, having a job that pays a decent wage not only provides for your children, but also gives you the freedom to become an active and engaged citizen. Nobody who is working 80 hours a week has time to forget about attending a rally, voting, interacting with neighbors, even going to church. A decent work and you need a livelihood to have that kind of freedom. If you're going to denounce corruption in your job, you are not going to do that as an individual unless you're in a system that already protects you, or if you've got a strong union at your back who enables you to take that risk to call out something and to hold people accountable for corruption. You cannot, as a woman worker, talk about gender-based violence in your workplace as an individual. I mean, even here in the US, if we look back a few years at Me Too, that happened because lots of people spoke up, not because those were powerful people, not because a single woman took that issue on at her own. So we see in Department of Labor and the work that we do to protect worker rights, workers' rights to organize, as fundamental to tackling a lot of these issues by building democratic worker organizations that enable the vote, participation, and the economic and family stability that give people the basis for being active citizens in their communities. So I'll mention just a couple of these and then look forward to questions. So since the root causes strategy was announced, Department of Labor has put a full-time labor attaché in the region. We have only 10 attachés in the world. We're a domestic agency. Our work is mostly in the US. And we have only 10 folks overseas. One is based in our embassy in Guatemala, who is responsible for engaging with labor movements, with employers, obviously with our own embassies and governments on labor issues and rights. We have $40 million in active technical cooperation programs. Those are partnering with civil society groups. Those are also working with government and employers to enhance conditions. I'll mention two very briefly. One that works with the trade union movement. And through that project, this will seem like small numbers, but if you understand the region that we're talking about, it's important, has secured wage increases through collective bargaining for close to 500 banana workers in Honduras. That same union has also negotiated clauses in collective bargaining agreements and multinational agreements with banana brands against gender-based violence and harassment on plantations, so where people are working, and in the world of work beyond that. Program that we have that's focused on occupational safety and health in the sugar sector in El Salvador, where chronic kidney disease is rampant, has brought in the largest sugar mill in the country, the Sugar Growers Association, and is now working with multinational and including US brands of beverages that use a lot of sugar in their products, I won't name them, on occupational safety and health standards. Why these two examples are important, they're in agricultural regions that are very low income, are tremendously susceptible to climate change and disasters. And they're areas that a lot of people migrate out from because they're not having an opportunity for safety at work, because they're not making ends meet, and because their livelihoods are very much dependent on the climate. So just a couple examples of why it's so important that labor and decent work are integrated in the root causes strategy across the board, and some of the things that we're doing so far. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very motivated by your last comments of integrating labor. I think is fundamentally important. I have a question for each one of you, but also I think there is sort of a silver lining taking place in the current political crisis in the region. Something that it's not optimistic. You don't see the optimism taking place right now because of the large magnitude of problems taking place, but there is a growing discontent with the current president of Honduras. It's going, basically, the president is moving against the tide, against all of the commitments that he promised to have committed. Instead, is introducing legislation that is going against some government promises. And the popularity of President Castro or President Zelaya has dropped practically by half in the past 6 months. We also see the Guatemalan spirit really prevailing in the midst of a almost constant effort to prevent the political process to follow an electoral outcome in a free and fair context. And we see also, despite all the challenges of the policing state in Nicaragua, there is growing dissent even within the circle of power of Daniel Ortega, to the extent to which the basis of ruling in that regime is becoming more apparent to be of a Talibanistic style type of government. And yet El Salvador is still, people are still going through this euphoria of feeling free to walk in the streets. But this, I don't know what you call it, but this is short-lived. We remember the experience in Nicaragua when Somoza was overthrown, and what people in the street were saying, let the Sandinistas stay as long as they want because we don't have a dictator anymore. And that's the same statement that El Salvadorans are making today. But I see, is the administration's thinking that there is a silver lining over right now in the region that is moving away from these authoritarian efforts in the region? That's my general question. Then I have a couple of questions to each of you, one question to each of you. Eric, I see to some extent there is some reluctance on the administration to draw the line on the political transgressions taking place in the region. And in particular, I'm concerned that we don't have the special envoys on the Northern Triangle. We should have a special envoy on Central America addressing some of these issues. Where do we draw the line when there are violations of different sets of constitutional rights? It concerns me that there seems to be no foreign policy on Nicaragua. Milady, I'm very impressed by the work that USAID has done and trying to sort of pair the immigration side with the development side. But I see the elephant in the room is missing, and that's remittances from a development standpoint. Nicaragua, again, it became the largest remittance-dependent country in the world this year. 33% of remittances are part of GDP for Nicaragua, but for the other countries, 22% for Guatemala. Guatemala used to have 8% remittance dependence. El Salvador, 26%. Honduras, 28%. So how do we leverage that? Because there are savings, there is evidence that the intention to migrate decreases among those who formalize their savings, among those who receive remittances. And Molly, I'm really impressed by the effort on labor rights. But I was also impressed by the Biden administration's first executive order when he took over. And he made a specific statement about looking at labor and environment under CAFTA. That was his first order of business. And we are 2 years now, and I don't know where do we stand with that, especially Chapter 16 in the CAFTA agreement that talks about the formation of labor and environmental councils. And so far, they haven't been set up since 2019, and there is very little addressed. And the relevance of it is important because there are over 1,000 free trade businesses working in the free trade zone in the region. And they control basically 2/3 of CAFTA-related exports to the United States. They're hiring about 1 million workers. That's, take a few plus a minute, but that's about 10% of the formal labor force in Central America, or the total labor force in Central America. So, there are serious labor rights violations. We know there are labor rights violations in Nicaragua, in the free trade zones. We also know there are labor rights violations in the mining companies in Guatemala, in Honduras. So, how do we activate that? So I leave that open, and then, after that, I welcome the colleagues to give you the softballs.
Thank you. Thanks, Manuel. You're right. I think there is an exciting moment. And I think just to talk a little bit about Guatemala for a second here, I mean, this is first and foremost a tribute to the Guatemalan people, what we're seeing happening. But also, by including sort of, the sort of democratic moment we're seeing is, the private sector is really stepping up, civil society, but you're also seeing a lot from the international community. And it's heartening to see at the Organization of American States and elsewhere, countries like throughout the region, like Antigua, Barbuda, others who are stepping up with regard to Guatemala and supporting democratic institutions. So, first and foremost, a tribute to the Guatemalan people, but also really a lot of exciting things going on in Guatemala, support from others, and standing up to an attorney general whose job is to protect the Guatemalan people, but who's ultimately undermined that institution. So, we've been proud to use tools at our disposal to sanction some of these individuals, but more importantly, right now, to really stand with some of these democratic institutions in favor of a free and fair election in Guatemala. I think, in terms of your question about, standing up, speaking out, I think, we constantly are evaluating what is the most efficacious approach to these various challenges. So I think the challenges you lay out certainly exist. And it often is a question whether or not public diplomacy is appropriate, private diplomacy, visa revocations, global Magnitsky sanctions. What is that perfect formula? And, it's often hard to find exactly sort of what that formula is, but sort of always looking to see what the best approach is on this. In Honduras, pressure from civil society, from independent institutions ensured a free and fair election in 2021. And we need to continue to support those independent voices in a politically polarized environment to support civil society in those countries. And I know USAID is doing a lot of really impressive work in this space. In terms of Nicaragua, I would disagree on the notion there's no foreign policy in Nicaragua. What you've seen over the past year and a half or so was an escalatory approach where you had, the reallocation of Nicaragua's sugar allocation. You had the sanctioning of Enaminas, the state's mining ministry, and then the executive order from President Biden in October 2022, which authorized certain sanctions. And, I think there's different, questions of the approach, what sort of, again, that right formula of carrots and sticks, and we continue to evaluate what that is. And obviously, no one would disagree that what's going on in Nicaragua is extremely troubling, and especially right now with Bishop Alvarez, even though the 222 prisoners were released in February, that's not the end. We saw the stripping of the citizenship, but then we see continued imprisonment, and what's happening with the bishop is particularly troubling. But again, I think I would agree with you that there's a silver lining right now. There's a lot of good stuff happening in the region in spite of major challenges and pushback and corrupt institutions. And so, the last thing I'd say on that, just on Honduras, when we talk a little bit about the tools at our disposal, with the 353 sanctions, the visa revocations recently came out in Honduras. One thing that we were heartened by was when Yanni Rosenthal and Samuel Garcia, two legislators, were designated, their visas were revoked. In the Honduran Congress, the Liberal Party bloc actually voted, and the vote was not 1, but 8-6 on the opposite direction on expulsions. They ultimately are not expelled, but I think it was just a sign that sometimes these designations make a difference, and they have in the region. So trying to find that right formula is, probably impossible, but we continue to work at it and see, what that perfect mix is.
Thanks, Manuel, for that softball, as you called it. No, look, in terms of our day-to-day development work and migration, having these two strategies, the Central America strategy and the collaborative migration management strategy, has really made our development work in the region evolve over time, right? I think that's why you have DHS, right? We're not a migration agency, but the way that we're viewing the flow of migration throughout the hemisphere, we're doing it in multiple ways, right? I think the H2 work, creating more opportunities for seasonal workers has really been something new for USAID, which I think is something to be proud of. We know that a lot of migrants leave for the issues that we've discussed earlier, but really for economic opportunities. So we want to provide those options for people to stay at home, right, and not take the dangerous journey. I'm sure, as an immigrant myself, my parents would have not chosen to have, fled communist Cuba if it wasn't for a whole set of issues, but really providing for a better future. So, in terms of remittances specifically, I think that's an untapped resource that we as an agency have not taken a close look to see how we can leverage remittances with our foreign assistance, because it is a significant portion, right? You've mentioned 30% in Nicaragua, but over 20% in Central America and in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So there's definitely there an opportunity for us to see what more we can do with remittances. I know this is an area of expertise of yours. But again, early on, I think we heard, well, there really isn't an interest for countries in the region to do more stopping the flow of migration because, they're getting a lot of remittances in return and it's sustaining a lot of their economy. But I beg to differ because I don't think people would really take the dangerous journey if they had opportunities at home. So in the last 2 years, we've worked with the private sector and even small, medium enterprises, over 10,000 to create and sustain over 100,000 jobs, which is significant, right? Worked with farmers. I mean, cases of women-led enterprises that had subsistence farming as their main resource, and now they're creating work and opportunities where maybe their husband, in one case in particular, a woman whose husband came to the U.S. Was deported, was able to create a business because of the seed funding that we provided so she can grow her own work, and now they have a partnership. So we're seeing cases where even people that have returned to the region based on the support that they've received through our assistance. So in addition to the H2 and seasonal workers program that we have, we're doing more in integration. We see that more people are deciding to stay in the region that come north, right? So if you look at media and everything you're hearing is, no, most people are fleeing to come north, but the numbers are showing that most migrants that fled, whether it's Venezuela and other parts of the region, have decided to stay in Latin America. So beyond our work in Central America, we're working in places where we even closed our missions 10 years ago, like Panama, Belize, Costa Rica, and other parts of the hemisphere, where we're trying to have an integration policy to make it more humane, working with our host countries, make sure that their policies provide opportunities for people to stay. So that has also changed the game for us, right, as a development agency. And it's a paradigm, and I don't think it's going to go away. Our administrator is extremely involved in the work that we do in the integration space, but also an advocate, a very strong advocate for a seasonal workers program. And lastly, the pillars of the root causes strategy, that's really our day job. That's what we will continue to do. As I mentioned earlier, we've doubled down on those efforts. We've seen some gains, not the panacea. But again, it's looking at our foreign assistance from a development perspective in a new way, right? Our leadership throughout the hemisphere, our workforce and our colleagues in the region, we've been used to working on development, I think with un cambio aquí y allá, in a very, traditional way. So I think this really changes the paradigm so we can maximize and optimize our foreign assistance, like remittances. Again, I think we've piloted in one place or another, but we need to do more.
Thank you very much. And actually, the un cambio aquí y allá is very, it pays off. The number of H2 visas increased from 3,000 to 20,000 this year, 3,000 in 2019 to 20,000 this year. So there's no question that there is an important effort being made aquí y allá, but yeah. Molly.
start with the bright spots or the silver linings, which is, I think, civil society, both their endurance, their ability to really withstand a lot of attacks, and the bridges that are being built between different kinds of groups. I'll mention a few that we've seen in our work. So I mentioned Honduras earlier, and in particular, what has grown over the last few years. So I'm not going to attribute this directly to the root causes strategy, but what I see as a tremendous example of resilience and strength and growth is what has sort of bridges built between the labor movement and women's movements and feminist organizations, starting out on the subject of gender-based violence, including gender-based violence in the workplace, but also focused on women's leadership in labor spaces in a really tangible way. So if you look at the Honduran labor movement and their leadership, this is global. This is not just in Northern Central America. They have a huge percentage of women leading trade unions. They have a national trade union federation president who's a woman. And you have a lot of young women who are coming up as leaders in particular, the maquila sector and garment factories. So that's important, obviously, for women's economic livelihoods. It's important for being able to take direct action on gender-based violence in factories, but it's also important for a whole cohort of democratic activists, civil society activists who are building their strengths in these spaces. And so that's one bridge between these women's organizations in Honduras and the labor movement. I would mention, again, outside of root causes, but looking at the labor movement in Costa Rica, where they've developed a really good practice of representing Nicaraguan migrants, particularly in the agriculture sector. So if you look at folks who are voiceless, who have migrated, who are in, again, a marginalized sector outside of their home countries, to see civil society organizations, not just, including them as members, but taking them in as a part of their strategy and enhancing their leadership is really important. And then finally, in Guatemala, I would point to the bridges that have been built, again, between labor organizations and human rights organizations, in particular around violent attacks against human rights defenders and labor defenders. Globally, there's not always a bridge between labor and human rights defenders, even though labor rights are some of the most frequently violated set of human rights on earth. They've been in sort of separate categories, human rights defenders over here, labor rights defenders over there. But what you've seen in response to the adversity and the shared challenges that they face is that they've built much stronger monitoring, reporting, and advocacy networks in what used to be sort of separate camps. So when I look at the region in bright spots and silver linings, I look at what has persisted, and it's in particular the activism of civil society. That is something that we continue to support both through the Department of Labor, but obviously our other development and diplomatic engagement. As far as CAFTA, I recognize the challenge, and I recognize that we have not set up the labor and environment councils. That said, I think if we look at the last couple of years of engagement under this administration, we have been doing a lot around those spaces to, in particular, I won't step on USTR's toes, but to look at labor rights violations, ongoing labor complaints. We have very deep engagement with governments in the regions around labor action plans, and they get down to very nitty gritty. What are you doing about your inspection laws? How many inspectors have you hired? How are they getting paid? How are things being enforced? We have those with the majority of governments in the region. We have, as I mentioned, an attaché. We have a non-attaché who essentially comes up here, I think, to refresh on groceries and flies right back down to engage with governments. We've been able to do a lot through both technical assistance and government-to-government engagement on meeting the requirements of the trade agreement that already are out there, but I recognize there are still a lot of challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, Nicaragua, Guatemala has 100 labor inspectors in a labor force of over 4 million people. Nicaragua has 10 labor inspectors. Of course, it's Nicaragua, unfortunately. Plus, there is the persecution against private sector businesses in El Salvador, in Guatemala, well, take that back, in Honduras and Nicaragua, even confiscations, criminalization, etc. So we have several challenges. I'm going to start for the easy questions on this side. We'll without ideological positioning, we start with the left. the center, and the right. So please welcome. If not, I'll ask you a question. So anyone? Okay, we have a softball here.
Hi, Joy Olson. Eric, I just wanted to ask, well, congratulations on legal path. The concept of trying to shift this over. In terms of refugee crossing out of southern Mexico, sense of when that's actually going to happen, because there's also a component of there needs to be some there. Things concepts being put out in terms of legal pathways. So what's it, and is it just for people who are 4 countries you mentioned who are already there? Does it apply to people who are still coming? When are we going to get this fleshed out? Thank you.
No, appreciate the question, Joy. I think relatively quickly. I think this is something that there's a lot of momentum on between President Lopez Obrador, between our leadership at the White House. So I think that should start relatively soon. The initial ideas with those individuals from the CHNV countries, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. But in addition to sort of, if those individuals don't qualify for the relevant pathways, I think the idea, as with the safe mobility offices, is to find ways to incorporate other legal pathways, including labor pathways, including legal pathways to other countries outside of the region or within the region. In terms of other individuals outside of those 4 countries, not aware at this point, but happy to take that and get back to you.
Any other questions? We have Mary and side. Leonor.
So hi, I'm Leonor Arteaga, the Process of Law Foundation. Question especially for Eric, but of course anyone can answer. I mean, it has been heartening to see how the U.S. has recently taken a more active role in promoting the rule of law and democratic values in Guatemala, and we hope to see this kind of involvement in El Salvador as well. In particular, I mean, how do you see or how do you think about the idea of Bukele re-election is perceived by U.S. government, especially given that the consecutive presidential election is prohibited by the Constitution of El Salvador, and also in light of the cooptation of government institutions in El Salvador being done by the executive.
Let me take another question, Mary.
Actually, just to follow up on the El Salvador question, I was wondering, because we have been focusing on Guatemala, and that is heartening to see the unification there. But meanwhile, in El Salvador, we just announced mass trials of defendants. And I'm wondering what the indication, if there are any indications that that this administration is looking beyond the state of exception and is looking at all into rehabilitation and reintegration. I mean, it doesn't sound like it, mass trials. But on the other hand, perhaps behind the scenes, there are efforts to reach out to the community. I know the ambassador has urged them to do that, and to restart some of the programs that USAID had, some good programs in prisons and some good programs in these neighborhoods.
Any more questions? A third question? Okay, so we have a few questions from the audience virtually, but why don't you answer this one?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Milady, if you want to comment as well on this, given all the excellent work that USAID does on violence prevention throughout the region. But I just say, more generally in El Salvador, I think our record is clear over the past 2.5 years in terms of responding to all these issues on democracy, human rights, governance. I think you've seen that through public statements. You've seen that through our foreign assistance. You've seen that through visa revocations and other sanctions. In terms of, the election, as we've expressed previously, I would say that we respect the Salvadoran people's sovereign right to choose their elected leaders through democratic processes. And, on the state of exception, we certainly take these reports of human rights abuses seriously, and continue to monitor the situation in the prisons very seriously. So, we make our concerns known at every opportunity as we engage interlocutors in the Salvadoran government. But I would say that, again, as I sort of noted at the top, we constantly are looking at the most efficacious approach here. And I think when it comes to El Salvador, this is a complex relationship. It's multifaceted. We work together in a number of areas. Milady can get more into this, but in terms of foreign assistance, we're the top donor to El Salvador. There's a lot of really good engagement on socioeconomic issues. And then there are tough issues where we continue to engage in private and in public at times and try to find the most effective way to get at them.
Thanks, Eric. And Leonard, maybe that doesn't answer your full question. I mean, I think, as Eric said, it's a very complex relationship. Early on in 2021, we paused our assistance to the PNC, the Supreme Court, with the Attorney General's office, and that's a decision that we made early on. Democratic backsliding is being seen in all three countries, but I think in El Salvador is the one that's most worrisome. The state of exemption and to your question about are we engaged with communities that have been impacted, institutions. Just today we have a representative from the First Lady's office. Our mission is involved in trying to work in these communities that are impacted, not only with the victims' families that have the legal and psychosocial needs at the moment, but we are finding ways to continue to work with the Bukele administration. We'll continue to do that. I think our work is not directly with an administration, but it's with the people of El Salvador, and that's our commitment to continue to do that. I think the next few months will be extremely challenging, especially next year with the election. From USA's perspective, we're working on ensuring that we promote free and fair and democratic participation, working with organizations locally to ensure that people do come out to vote. I don't think that will be an issue in El Salvador. With the president continues to enjoy a very high approval rating despite everything that's happening. I think social media has been really another interesting, at least from a development assistance point of view, an evolution, right? I think with Meta, we have partnered with Meta to ensure that they do play a role, right? And working with NGOs and working with civil society at large to ensure that misinformation does not factor in. So again, I think our ambassador has been extremely forward-leaning and trying to engage with the administration in a way to convey what our priorities are as an administration, and we're keeping a very close eye.
You want to add something? No? Okay, we have a few questions from the audience. I don't know if anyone from the virtual audience. One is open-ended to everyone. How is the U.S. Engaging the diaspora? And I say open-ended because when we're talking about labor, we're also talking about migrant labor in the United States. Second question is the administration factoring corruption when considering work within the context of Central America Forward? And there is another question. How is Nicaragua affecting the rule of law in the region? I shared some of you that Rosario Murillo has been actively reaching out to the presidential candidate against Arevalo, trying to tell her that él sí es comunista. So, don't go against us. So, is there something else with regards to Nicaragua that we should be worried about? So I'll leave those questions. There is another question, excuse me, from Abe Lowenthal, asking, might it be viable to consider a strategic cooperation framework between the North American countries and other pivotal countries that have worked in cooperation in the region to address these challenges together?
Great, thanks. I can start with a few. So on the diaspora, I think certainly engaging. We have a senior advisor in the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau who's committed to diaspora outreach and has done a lot of outreach, specifically with the Salvadoran community, but with communities throughout the Americas. So definitely an important area. And then one that we like to do more on and sort of welcome ideas on that moving forward. In terms of the question of corruption in Central America forward, I think that's front and center. So originally this was the call to action and a focus on investment in the region. And Central America forward, the aim is to bring in a rule of law element here. And so, with Central America forward, we have the pledge from companies, but we also have an ability for companies to be forced to exit if they're not meeting certain commitments. So, I think that's an important element. It's tough. I mean, but we continue to sort of see that there's opportunities to engage the private sector on these areas, and I hope frankly, given what's happening in Guatemala, that there might be efforts with the private sector that's really stepped up in a major way in recent months to work more collaboratively on issues of corruption and rule of law in the coming months, regardless of who wins the presidency in Guatemala. On the Abel Lowenthal idea, interesting idea. I'd have to think about that a little bit. And I think, Milady probably could speak a little bit to the good work they've been doing with the Mexicans in terms of cooperation on Central America. But we'll let her sort of, she's the expert on that and was just down there. But certainly I think there's an opportunity for Alliance for Development and Democracy, for others who work on democracy issues to play a constructive role in the region and been hardened by the role of Costa Rica, for example, and what they've said on Guatemala and how they've been outspoken and helpful on that front. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a very fair question on the Nicaraguan experience affecting the rule of law in the region. I mean, hard to exactly boil down what that means, but we've even seen Nicaragua serve as a place of refuge for ex-presidents who are trying to escape. You see that with Mauricio Funes, you've seen that with others. So certainly a model that's troubling and that we do worry about being exported elsewhere.
Thanks, Eric. On the diaspora piece, that's one area where I think USAID could do more of. I mean, as a foreign assistance agency, we don't necessarily work with the diaspora here, but it's just like remittances is another untapped resource that we have, not only on educating, right, like how US taxpayers' money is spent, because a lot of our communities that live here, especially in the DMV area, but throughout our country, should be proud of the work that our agency is doing to support communities back home. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there for us to socialize the work that USAID does throughout the hemisphere with our communities. In terms of having Northern American countries, to leverage our assistance or to support some of the work we do in the region. I just came back from Mexico a couple of days ago, and I was there to officially launch a partnership with Canada, Mexico, and us as a trilateral cooperation to increase our assistance in Central America. This was something that was announced last year at the North American Leaders Summit with President Biden, President AMLO, and Prime Minister Trudeau. We always talk about, working with like-minded countries and ensuring that our assistance is not duplicated. And I think this is really an intentional partnership because not only are we putting our resources together, we're also targeting the beneficiaries that we support, right? So it's not just, ensuring that we support in a number of thematic areas, but ensuring that we're working in the same communities, targeting the same beneficiaries to ensure that, there's a long-lasting impact. I think there's been an intentional effort by the Biden and Harris administration, clearly under the LA Declaration, to do that. The Alliance for Development and Democracy is also, another partnership that we continue to support and want to see grow because, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, and the Dominican Republic really have a lot to offer, right? And it's not only just U.S. government trying to support and advancing a lot of the agenda that we've talked about, but having others support us in the process. So I think it's been a very collaborative process. We want to see more of that, and there's more to do. In terms of Nicaragua, look, Manuel, I think we share those concerns. Under my supervision, I see Mexico and Central America. And Nicaragua it's the one place where I think the work that USAID has been able to do with unfortunately, most of our implementers, of our beneficiaries, and even the opposition, if you were to call it like that, have actually left in exile. There's also, the Monteverde process, which we continue to work or track closely to ensure that there's an alternative, right? The voice the only news that comes out of Nicaragua, it's controlled by Ortega Murillo, but I think there has been a lot of effort, especially by independent media, to put a spotlight on Nicaragua, right? We need to continue doing that, ensuring that we use our human rights systems in the region to investigate, to document, to report. That's necessary. So I'm really proud of the work that even those that have been able and forced to flee continue to do to keep a spotlight on Nicaragua.
Thank you, Molly.
Address the question on diaspora communities. Because I am from a domestic agency, we have a lot of engagement with diaspora here in the US, but for purposes of this conversation, I'll focus on what we're doing under the collaborative migration management strategies in what we call our consular partnership program. So Department of Labor supported the creation of a network that involves some of our domestic agencies like the Wage and Hour Division, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, who are the agencies that are responsible for enforcing working conditions here in the US, overtime pay, minimum age of work, safety and health rules. And we work with the consulates and the embassies of countries of origins here in the US. We work with our embassies, obviously overseas, and we work with civil society and worker organizations on both sides. So that's allowed us to deepen some relationships with consulates here, which are usually the most trusted places for people to go when they are experiencing violations of their rights at work. They are not likely to come straight to the Department of Labor. They go to where people speak their language, where they have some trust with the community, or they go to community-based organizations. So most recently, I'm sure everybody has read about child labor in the United States. We've been meeting intensively with at first the embassy levels and then with consular levels across the United States to talk about how we can respond to that, what they can do with information that they're getting, how to connect victims to enforcement. We also work with civil society organizations and stakeholders to identify and then sort of report back areas where there is migration recruitment fraud. So when people are trying to come to the US, whatever channels, they're often deceived or they're receiving misinformation and they can fall victim to a lot of rights violations when they get here. So working with stakeholders and communities, we're able to get information, not just know your rights, but also watch out for this organization or watch out for this message so that people are protected before they even travel. We are coming up this week, and this is the most developed model, so I'm going to hold it up as sort of an example from where we could go. At the end of this month will be Labor Rights Week, which is a exercise we have with the Embassy of Mexico on all sorts of labor rights issues in the US and now in Mexico. That's a much more developed model because it's something we've been dealing with for a long time, but I see that as a direction in which we're going with our work with the consulates and embassies here. Like a whole new series of videos that are coming out that week on migrant rights here in the US and what happens, what your rights are when you work in the United States. Briefly on Central America Forward, not corruption directly, but I do want to speak to the good jobs part of it, which is first, companies are vetted, right? We vet them very carefully. We look at their history with workers, but it is a space for us to engage, to ask for companies that are good to be better, to seek out, and we're planning on doing more of this in the fall with a sort of good jobs focus to be better. So yes, investment is good. Yes, jobs are good, but not every job is automatically a good job. And so we're looking at the Central America Forward space is a way to engage with investors and companies to make sure that worker rights are respected and to make sure that the jobs that are being created through Central America Forward are good jobs that provide families with the stability and the livelihood they need to be active citizens in their communities.
Thank you, Molly. I think this is wonderful news on the migrant rights issue, especially when we have 30% of the female migrant labor force working in domestic work, which is a highly under-monitored, under-addressed issue. We're talking about at least 7 million migrant workers cleaning at least 3 homes each. That's 20 million homes in the United States. So really, really valuable. And Milady, I'm glad this relationship with Mexico is working in that direction, because it's better what President AMLO has offered with the Sembrando Arbolitos approach, which didn't, the seed didn't grow really in any direction. We have 2 more questions to go before we finish. One basically is asking, I think the answer may be easier to have, but we still want to hear it. How is the root causes strategy addressing child migration? And the other question is there room for a bipartisan approach on Central America? I know we're getting close to election timing, and it gets more complicated to make into these bipartisan commitments. But I think the next 18 months for Central America are going to be critical. And so, that's an open-ended question. You can treat it academically, off the record. I can turn off the camera.
Read it off the record. No, I mean, I would actually argue that not only is there room for a bipartisan approach, but I think we're seeing a bipartisan approach right now. When it comes to Guatemala, saw a very strong statement from the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Menendez, and the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mike McCall, Republican from Texas, speaking out on efforts to obstruct the Guatemalan election. So I think we see that. Is it perfectly bipartisan? No, certainly not. And I know from my time on the Hill that these issues are challenging and not necessarily as bipartisan. But we saw it on the passage of the bill that led to the 353 section visa revocations and designations. So I think a real commitment on that piece as well. So I think to answer your question, yes, I think there's certainly room. Ultimately at the end of the day, the appropriations bills that pass through Congress in this climate need to in some way be bipartisan. So if you look at the sort of, the foreign assistance, this is something that is sort of, the way that the sausage is made is in a bipartisan way. So I think there's space to do more, but I think there certainly is bipartisanship and certainly on these issues of governance, human rights, rule of the law, I think there is a commitment across the board. Well, you all want to address the second question, but I think everything we do in the root cause strategy certainly addresses child migration, especially, the numbers of the border are obviously down from where they were before the end of Title 42. But if you look at the numbers of unaccompanied minors showing up, family units, those have increased. So I think very much we're always thinking about child migration. It's at the core of what we're doing. It's the core of, frankly, the strategy that the Obama administration developed in the summer of 2014, and certainly at the center of what we're doing right now with the root cause strategy under the Vice President's leadership.
Related, but yes, I'll take the next question and then proceeded to sit on my microphone. On child migration, obviously our focus from Department of Labor is on the child labor aspect. I just explained a little bit of how that works with migrants in the US, but within the root causes strategy more broadly and the work that we do overseas, child labor globally accounts for more than half of our technical assistance work. So that includes programs that work with sort of alternatives to child labor, with education systems, working on enforcement. We mentioned the problem of inspection, and also decent work and livelihoods for adults. So child labor is where the DOL comes at it, but it's a very big part of our work, both overseas as well as through our partnership with domestic agencies here in the US.
I would add to Eric's good answer that I think we do enjoy a lot of the bipartisan support, not on every issue, but I think our budget demonstrates, right, the support that we've been getting to increase the budget for the region. I think, again, we could do better, but definitely it's a sign of support, the increase that we've been getting over the years. In terms of the unaccompanied minor and what more could we do with to prevent, right, more UACs from seeing them at the border, our work throughout the hemisphere and really in Central America, we've done more at the primary and secondary level of education. I think when we have kids, remaining in school, that you're supporting their parents through, different types of economic opportunities, it creates, a sense of rootedness. And again, we have data that demonstrates that where we have invested, especially these communities where we're seeing UACs, unaccompanied minors migrate at higher numbers, remain in school, right? And completing and then providing support after even school, right? So it's really taking a holistic approach and ensuring that the family is also supported so the kids could remain in school and they're not another number.
Thank you very much. I mean, definitely, the unaccompanied minor problem hasn't declined. Half of unaccompanied minors are actually from Guatemala, which is a striking number of the 500,000 kids that have arrived since 2019 until today. I want to thank you for participating in this conversation. The list of activities and commitments is extensive, and I think you agree that there is a work in progress. The challenges require a much more stronger proportional response to the issues and the foreign policy toolbox that you have at hand. But I think we still have the commitment from the administration to move forward in this direction to prevent further for Nicaraguans from happening and to focus on economic development at the same time. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.